as we are really just thinking about all the top stories that we have been covering for you guys. Of course, one of them is the rising case of PTSD and anxiety. So we were speaking about this earlier. We talked about the book The God Shot with Dr. Eugene Lipov. Now he's joining us once again. He is the author of the book. Thank you so much for another conversation with us here on Fox 5 Weekend Live. So when we talk about what we consume on a regular basis, correct, and how that impacts our mental and physical health, a lot of us are on social media where we're consuming different kind of products like memes, viral videos. How does that play out and work with our mental health?
Well, thank you for having me on again. What happens is meme, actually, if you watch something that's disturbing enough times, it can affect the brain and it can lead to mental illnesses. And actually, it can present things that it looks like real illnesses. For example, there was an epidemic, in quotes, of Tourette syndrome, like in this high school in New York in 2020s. So what happens is when you watch it enough, there are something called echo neurons. Echo neurons was studied when you have people were watching other people going through something, and then both got scanned. The brain change was the same. And brain also has a tendency of predicting danger. So if you watch memes enough, the brain feels like it's going through a danger. That starts to change the brain itself, and then it leads to problems. You get stuck in a position, people have difficulty sleeping, and then they get weak, they get tired, and that makes them depressed. So this whole cycle is a big problem. Also, watching the phone, being distracted all the time, makes you exhausted. Again, it affects the sleep. And if you don't get good sleep, then you can't think straight. And that can lead to depression and anxiety.
So what are some studies that have given evidence about this, about what we're consuming online that could truly give us those symptoms of anxiety?
What specifically happens in the brain? Is that the question?
Yeah, what have you guys found? Like what specifically happens when I'm on Instagram or I see a meme?
Right. Yeah, so if it's pleasant, if it's watching a cat meowing, that's one thing. But if it's scary, it activates a part of the brain called the amygdala. Amygdala is a fear center. So I usually say if amygdala is not happy, nobody is happy. So it's anxiety and it's got activated, right? And then it activates the rest of the system. So your heart beats faster, your blood pressure goes up. If you do it day in and day out, your blood pressure goes up, and you know that's bad for you. That can affect your heart and your kidneys and the rest of the body. So it all starts in an amygdala. And amygdala has a tendency of predicting danger. That's its job, to make sure you don't get hurt. So that's what it's doing all the time. And the best thing to do, in my opinion, is to limit the amount of memes you watch per day, and definitely don't watch much stuff right before you go to bed, because it affects your sleep, and again, that has a cycle. You're more vulnerable in the future.
Absolutely. So when we talk about social media, right, it's still such a new thing. I mean, it's been a couple of years. Obviously, it's been more than a decade now. And it's kind of like when the car was invented, where in the beginning, it was fun, it was exciting. At the same time, for safety reasons, many different features were added. And when we talk about social media, it seems as though ever since it's come out, I mean, it's a way to share how we feel, reactions, memes, as you mentioned. And now that we're talking about how what we are consuming can really have an impact on up here and, how we're feeling, shouldn't there be a responsibility to have a disclaimer or have multiple disclaimers for instance, on X, Instagram, Facebook, to say, consuming this could be bad for you?
Well, I totally agree with that. In fact, I have been watching that play out because they've been a number of congressional hearings about that. And the other problem, in my opinion, is that a lot of those memes are watched by very young kids. They cannot process as well as adults, and childhood trauma is a really huge problem. So when you have childhood trauma like that, then they become anxious adults. And we start to see that already. So when you start watching memes, let's say at 10, and at 20, now those adults are anxious and are also addicted to the machine. They cannot put down the phone. That all creates a problem. Then it activates fight and flight system, and you're always anxious, and it creates continuous anxiety that potentially lead to suicides. Right now, this is the highest time for suicide since World War II, and this is a part of the problem. It's not the only part, but a lot of it is a problem.
And Dr. Eugene Lipov, now you yourself, you're an author, right? And you've wrote this book, The God Shot. What can the medical community do right now to make their voices heard when it comes to these laws changing, when it comes to these social medias doing whatever they want? Do you think there is more that can be done with healthcare professionals and medical professionals? What can they do to really, impact changes and make sure that there are certain rules in place that are illegal, so these social media companies can practice some discretion, they can, follow some rules, and potentially that could help people who are consuming these products, like that are teenagers, that are young children?
So here's what I would suggest doing the following. Real studies, meaning following people, and you can actually, if you can demonstrate specifically that those things create problems, things like wearing Oura Ring, this is a biological monitor, that if you could show that people watch so much TV, or consume so much media, or memes specifically, that affects their bodies. And if you can demonstrate it, and then it's called longitudinal study over time, if you can demonstrate specifically that's leading to suicides, heart attacks, and other problems, I think as clinicians, if you can have those type of study in our hands, I think we'll be much more successful just saying it's bad for you. Because there's not enough physiological data, but we are at the time medically that we can actually study it and demonstrate very specifically. You can actually show how the immune system changes by watching scary memes. It's amazing what you can do, but that needs to be studied.
Absolutely. I think everybody needs to educate themselves better. So we talk about the impact. What else? Is it just the memes, or is it certain kinds of videos? Anything else that we need to be careful of when we are on our phones? We're on Instagram all day. People are on TikTok all day, really. And TikTok, there have been a lot of warnings about that as well. There's different challenges, right? Like people are like, I'm doing this today, and I'm doing this challenge.
Right.
And that's kind of like where it started. Which particular social media are you seeing this rise more in, like Instagram?
Well, I think TikTok and Instagram, anything that have short reels, and YouTube is actually doing very short reels also. But I think some of those challenges my son has showed me are pretty spooky, like jumping out of buildings and not landing well. And I think it's funny. I thought, I don't think that's particularly funny. I used to be a trauma surgeon. I used to fix those type of people. But I think at the very least, if people can reduce the amount of time, because I try to talk to young people now, we're talking about under 20, they cannot sit still, and now people are wearing glasses that has internal displays. You don't even know they're watching it. So being distracted is really a huge problem. So I think putting down the phones, have a specific time, you want to be informed, that's really important. But at the same time, I don't think burning it out is a problem. And sitting and just going through a empty just information is the same. It's an endless call. But playing things like doing Legos or doing physical activities, maybe go back to nature. And the other thing, it's interesting, if you don't exercise, if you sit, you lose muscle. As you lose muscle, you become depressed. As you become depressed, you lose more muscle. All of that becomes a problem. So you need to get off the butt, put down the phone, and I know I sound like an old man, but physiologically that is happening for sure.
Great point there. So I want to talk to you about trauma, and a lot of people say this, it's like a thing right now on social media, a little bit of woo-woo, that trauma lives in the body. It's said by the spiritual community, and it's also said by chiropractors, correct? People come in after injuries and accidents, all of that jazz. And again, people who are watching us right now, we're in conversation with Dr. Eugene Lipov. Now, he's wrote a book about the God Shot. He is very informed when it comes to trauma. So when we talk about the spiritual aspect of it and also the medical aspect of it, how much do you agree with that? The body remembers everything.
Well, the body definitely remembers everything. What's interesting is that DNA can change. You can actually keep, if somebody's traumatized, they can pass that down 2, 3 generations. So the actual physical DNA changes. So all the trauma you go through is remembered. The question is, does it reach a certain threshold? If it gets bad enough, then it changes a lot of systems. That's the problem. Some trauma is actually good, it makes you stronger. But if you do it consistently and if you're vulnerable, it also depends on your DNA that you got from your parents, right? So all of that comes in together. As far as spirituality, I'd like to be able to measure what you can, but I think being spiritual has a place for you to go and kind of feel connected. If you can feel connected, that's oxytocin, and that makes you feel warm and cuddly. In fact, they're talking about giver's high, which is when you go and you volunteer, you feel good, you feel relaxed. It's really not spiritual per se, but studies have shown if you do something positive for humanity, you may live up to 10 years extra. So there is definitely, your body does remember this, and it keeps score.
I love that. And so when we talk about, what you just said, so profound, that trauma really, I mean, we can pass it on to the other generation. This is why I don't want to have kids. I'm kidding. But, you could even get trauma that was experienced, like generational trauma from your grandparents, correct? So that's an interesting anecdote there. What are the cases, like you mentioned, where actually trauma could be a good thing for you, right? So there's no way around it. If you're going to live a life, you're going to go through something or a lot compared to what your luck is, what you're born with. People who have a lot of trauma, how can that be a good thing for them? A lot of people say online that you're able to detect situations sooner and faster. You kind of have these psychic abilities, which I'm not talking about magic, but because your brain has experienced certain scary, fearful, tragic situations, you can potentially predict a person or an outcome or an energy. What's your take on that from a medical perspective?
Well, let's break that down. That's a very interesting question. So there is a term called hormesis. It's a medical term. It means what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. That was defined over a century ago. And what happened is the scientists gave antifungal drug to a fungus. They didn't kill it. But so the one that survived, that almost died, came out stronger. And actually turns out it turns on certain DNA, so it makes you stronger physically, and your recovery is quicker. I'll give you an example of my personal experience. I got hit by a propeller blade when I was in Mexico. I lost half of my blood volume in about 10 minutes. And I was in a tunnel that people talk about, that, tunnel to God. So it made me a lot more resilient in the future when I was faced with other adversities. So I think that's what I mean by that. As far as being able to predict future, I don't know, I'm not quite sure about that. But keep in mind with amygdala, we talked about amygdala, its job is to predict the future to protect you from danger. But I think if somebody's going through severe trauma, for example, I've done many people going through that, what happens, they know they can make it through it. So next time you're in a difficult position, you don't give up, you just keep working until you get through it. So I think that's totally true.
I'm not talking about prediction as in I'm looking at you and I can tell you're going to have 50 cars in 2 years. I'm thinking like if you are safe or not, as in a situation where, because you've gone through so many different things, now your brain is trained to be able to, help you decipher, okay, this situation is dangerous, this situation is not safe, or it is safe because of those experiences that were traumatizing.
Oh, I think you're totally correct. The other thing I can tell you, based on hormesis, there are experimental evidence that shows that DNA changes after trauma, people who survive, and some of them are more resilient. So when you're in this next tough situation, you're going to get through it much better. I think that's what you're talking about. Absolutely, there's science behind it, and actually DNA changes that actually do happen, which is fascinating.
I love that. So when we talk about people who are watching you at home, who are trauma survivors, and they are in this situation called freeze mode, when they go through something scary, it's like you don't experience emotions where you can't cry, and you're just functioning, you're going to work regularly, you're eating regularly, but you're not able to cry. Being from, the medical community, having written a book about PTSD anxiety, is freeze mode an actual thing?
Oh, no question. The person who developed that whole thing is Dr. Stephen Porges. Happens to be my friend. He's an amazing man. So what happens is it's fight, flight, or freeze. What it came from is if you're a reptile, or let's say you're a turtle, you get scared, you dive, you hold your breath, and everything slows down. Everything is slowed down, and you freeze because the predator is not going to find you. That's what happens in a turtle. Unfortunately, the same thing happens to us humans as vagal tone. What happens is if you get, let's say somebody is chasing you and you're running from it, that's fight and flight. If they catch you and they put a knife to your throat, that's when the vagal tone activates and you freeze. You can't do anything. In fact, the heart rate drops, blood pressure drops, and people faint. Yes, that's absolutely no question. I've seen it many times. When you put an IV in and people get scared, I've seen people drop to the floor just from the IV. And that's vagus. We know exactly what it is because I know how to fix it. If I give them medicine called atropine, it reverses that. They wake right up. It's really interesting to see that.
Interesting conversation, obviously, and so we really want to thank you for being on our show because mental health is a big topic here. Thank you so much for your insight.